Today, you can buy ginger for almost nothing. A few euros, a few dollars, maybe a small plastic bag in the produce aisle, sitting there between the garlic and the onions like it never mattered much at all. But for most of human history, ginger was not cheap. In medieval England, 1 pound of ginger could cost about as much as a live sheep, not a loaf of bread, not a handful of salt, a live animal. That single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about this root. Ginger was not just food, it was wealth, medicine, status, and in some places, a product worth risking lives to move across the world. So today, we're following ginger from the forests of Asia to royal tables, across the deadest trade routes in history, and then into the smuggling economy of the Caribbean. And once you see that journey, you will never look at this route the same way again. It begins in Asia, most likely in the tropical regions of Southeast Asia, where ginger had already been used for centuries before it ever reached Europe. It spread early through maritime trade. Austronesian seafarers helped carry plants across vast stretches of ocean long before modern shipping made that kind of movement feel routine. That matters because ginger was never a local curiosity for long. It became a traveling plant, a global one. By the time written sources begin to mention it, ginger is already being treated as something useful, valuable, and medically important. In China, it appears in early traditions linked to Confucius, where ginger was reportedly eaten with meals. In later Chinese medical practice, it was used for digestion, warmth, and general bodily balance. That same pattern showed up elsewhere too. In India, ginger was used as both spice and remedy. In the Mediterranean world, it entered trade networks carried by Arab and Persian merchants, who helped move it westward toward the Roman world. So, before ginger was ever a European luxury, it was already a connected product. It had a root, it had a reputation, and it had a price. By the time the Roman world is taking notice, ginger has already moved far from its original homeland. Arab merchants carried it along the Indian Ocean, using the monsoon winds to sail from Indian ports to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. From there, ginger could travel up the Nile from Red Sea ports, then cross into the Mediterranean and reach Alexandria and eventually Rome. Food historians who study museum collections and old trade maps show ginger moving through these routes: Indian Ocean ports, Red Sea corridors, caravan roads cutting toward the Levant, and finally the storerooms of Roman elites. Roman writers noticed it too. They describe ginger as something sharp, warming, and useful for the body. It appears alongside other Eastern luxuries like pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom. At this point, ginger is still rare. It doesn't sit in every tavern kitchen. It sits in the diets of the wealthy, in the prescriptions of physicians, and in the inventories of long-distance merchants. It's a foreign product that had to cross deserts, seas, and political borders dominated by middlemen. In fact, the Roman hunger for Eastern spices was so strong that emperors and generals wanted more direct access to those routes. They wanted to cut out the people in the middle. They wanted cheaper goods, faster routes, and control. And that pattern will repeat again and again. A distant plant becomes valuable. A network of middlemen forms around it. An empire gets impatient, and then ships and soldiers are sent out to change the game. By the Middle Ages, ginger had become one of Europe's most coveted imports. Urban centers were rising. Merchant classes were expanding. Italian city-states were inserting themselves into the spice trade, bringing Eastern goods into Northern Europe. Ginger benefited from all of it. Medieval recipe collections from English noble households and continental courts feature ginger in sauces, pies, and sweets. Gingerbread becomes a specialty. Dense cakes or biscuits flavored with honey and ginger, shaped and decorated, sometimes sold at fairs and even regulated by guilds. But none of this came cheap. In 14th century England, sources and later historians agree on a striking comparison. A pound of ginger could cost about as much as a sheep. That does not mean peasants were casually swapping livestock for spice in daily life. But it does tell us the scale. Ginger belonged to the same economic tier as livestock. Picture a medieval market town in England, mud streets, timber-framed houses, a stone church, and on a wooden table in a cramped stall, a few small sacks of dried ginger root and slices, each worth enough to buy an animal. That is what high-value trade looked like. At court feasts, ginger showed up in rich sauces and elaborate dishes. In apothecaries' shops, it appeared in remedies for digestion, colds, and weak stomachs. The same root was flavoring pastries in London and sitting in jars of medicine in monastic infirmaries. In that world, ginger was not a casual spice. It was a high-value import that only reached Northern Europe because someone was willing to carry it across immense distances at enormous risk. And that risk was not small. Ginger did not walk to Europe. It came by ship. And the ships that carried spices sailed some of the most dangerous routes in the early modern world. After 1500, the balance of power shifts again. Portuguese explorers round the Cape of Good Hope, pushing from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. They built forts along the coasts of Africa and India, trying to tap directly into the spice trade that Arab merchants had managed for centuries. Then Spanish, Dutch, English and French powers follow, each with their own fleets, each with their own armed trading companies, each with their own appetite for pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon and ginger. Life on these ships was brutal. One of the clearest examples is Magellan's expedition. About 270 men and boys left with the fleet in 1519. Only 18 returned to Spain 3 years later. That is not a bad voyage. That is a massacre by distance. And that is exactly the kind of world ginger belonged to, even if ginger itself was not the sole reason for every death. The spice trade was a system of risk, and ginger rode inside that system. That distinction matters. Because if we want to stay honest, we should not pretend ginger was the direct cause of thousands of deaths. The historical record does not support that claim. What it does support is something more interesting. Ginger was valuable enough to be shipped through the same lethal networks that made the Spice Age so dangerous in the first place. A root worth a sheep does not travel by magic. It travels by ship. And when ships are crowded, underfed, disease-ridden, and sent across oceans for profit, people die. Here is where the story gets even better. Because ginger was not only cargo, on some ships it was part of the defense against illness. A 5th century Chinese Buddhist monk named Faxian wrote about life at sea, noting the problem of scurvy, a disease we now know is caused by vitamin C deficiency. In that context, some accounts mention that ginger was carried on Chinese ships as a way to help keep scurvy at bay. It wasn't magic. Ginger does contain vitamin C, though not in huge amounts, and more importantly, it was used as a warming, stimulating, nausea-reducing medicine in Chinese tradition. That made it valuable on choppy seas where seasickness, digestive problems, and general weakness were constant threats. So, on some decks in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, ginger sat in pots and storage containers as more than just future trade goods. It was a survival strategy. In later centuries, European sailors would turn to citrus fruits and sauerkraut to fight scurvy, but ginger remained part of shipboard medical kits and folk remedies for seasickness and stomach issues. Even though it couldn't replace fresh fruit entirely, it fit into a broader pattern where certain plants carried more than economic value. They carried knowledge about how to stay alive at sea. That gives ginger's story a strange shape. On one ledger, it is pure commodity, weight, price, profit. On another, it is protection against the very conditions that make that profit so hard to obtain. It is both the cargo and part of the crew's chance of surviving the journey. And then ginger's next big chapter unfolds in the Caribbean. When European empires pushed across the Atlantic, they brought more than soldiers, priests, and guns. They brought plants. Spanish colonizers transplanted ginger from the Old World into New World soils in the early 16th century. Historical summaries and trade studies note that ginger was introduced to places like Hispaniola and Puerto Rico during the period of Spanish expansion, where it adapted well to the tropical climate. The result was dramatic. In the mid-16th century, Caribbean islands began exporting significant quantities of ginger back to Europe. One account cites that by 1547, more than 1,000 tons of ginger were shipped from Caribbean ports to European markets, making ginger one of the region's earliest and most important export crops. Think about what that means. The same route that started in Southeast Asia traveled through Indian and Arab networks into Roman kitchens and passed through medieval English counting houses is now being grown in the Americas and sold back across the Atlantic. Of course, this was not a neutral process. Those Caribbean plantations were not run by their original inhabitants. They were controlled by colonial powers that had already displaced or killed large parts of the local population. Enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers were forced to work fields, including fields where ginger grew alongside other export crops. Trade studies of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola during the 16th and 17th centuries describe an economy that depended heavily on agricultural exports like ginger and hides, often moved through systems of smuggling and unofficial trade when official channels were too restrictive or too slow. Ginger, at that point, became part of a larger pattern. Official export on the books, unofficial shipments in the shadows, a colonial system where land, labor, and crops were all controlled from elsewhere. So when we picture ginger barrels being loaded onto ships in Caribbean ports, we have to hold two truths at once. On one level, it is just a root, dried, cut, packed into barrels, weighed and sold. On another, it is a unit of value in an economy built on conquest and coercion. The same route that rode dangerous Indian Ocean monsoon routes now rides Atlantic trade routes linked to sugar, hides, rum, and slavery. That is the dark part of ginger's globalization. Anytime a commodity becomes valuable and a state tries to control how it can be shipped and sold, you can predict what comes next. Smuggling. The Spanish imperial system tried to tightly regulate colonial exports and imports through designated fleets and ports. But the reality on the water looked different. Independent traders, foreign ships, and local elites often smuggled goods in and out of places like Puerto Rico and Hispaniola when official controls were too rigid or too expensive. Academic work on Caribbean ginger in the period from 1570 to 1648 shows how quickly this oriental route, transplanted from Asia, flourished on Caribbean islands and became entangled in Atlantic trade, both legal and illegal. Ginger from these islands competed with and supplemented supplies from Asia, giving European buyers more sources and driving more traffic across the ocean. So, ginger becomes a legal export in cargo lists, contraband in hidden compartments, and collateral in the constant tug of war between imperial regulations and local economic realities. It is no longer just riding the dangerous routes, it is helping to justify them, and it is not done traveling yet. From Caribbean ports, ginger spreads into North American and European markets, and then into factories, bakeries, and breweries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, ginger is flavoring gingerbread sold to workers, ginger beers brewed for sailors and civilians, and medicinal syrups marketed as tonics and cures. This is where the story turns toward the present. Over the last 2 centuries, the world's relationship with ginger changes again. Steamships, railways, canals, and later airplanes compress distance. Industrial agriculture expands planting areas in India, China, the Caribbean, and Africa. Colonial and post-colonial trade systems push more and more product through ports at lower cost. The result is simple: the price falls and access rises. Ginger slowly shifts from elite ingredient to mass-market commodity. In Britain and other European countries, ginger moves into factory-produced biscuits, sweets, and cheap ginger beer for working-class drinkers. In North America, it appears in ginger ale, in holiday baking, and in patent medicines promising to settle the stomach. Meanwhile, in Asia and the Middle East, ginger keeps its older roles as a basic cooking ingredient and home remedy, only now plugged into modern supply chains, rather than caravans and lateen-rigged ships. Today, food writers and spice industry associations describe ginger as both an ancient medicinal plant and a key global commodity. Plant historians talk about it as one of the first luxury goods to travel truly global routes, carried by Austronesian sailors, Arab merchants, Roman fleets, Venetian traders, Portuguese caravels, Spanish galleons, Dutch East India ships, and British merchantmen, and then finally standardized into modern cargo. Yet when you and I walk down a grocery aisle, none of that is visible. We see a price tag, maybe a country of origin, that's all. The root itself is silent. So let's go back to that supermarket bin. You reach down and pick up a piece of ginger. It is light in your hand. It smells sharp and bright. You might be thinking about tea, soup, a curry, or maybe a baking recipe you saw on a cooking channel. But inside that root is a 3,000-year story. It began in the rain-soaked islands of Southeast Asia, carried by Austronesian sailors in wooden boats. It moved into Indian and Chinese medical systems as both remedy and spice. It crossed deserts and seas with Arab merchants and arrived in Roman ports as an exotic luxury. It became so prized in medieval England that a pound of it could buy you a sheep. It rode on ships so dangerous that only a fraction of the crew might ever see home again. It sat in pots on some decks as a way to fight scurvy and sickness. It was planted in Caribbean soil and turned into an export crop, wrapped up with smuggling, plantation economies, and colonial control. And it ended up here, in your kitchen. The root hasn't changed much. We have. We've turned a luxury commodity into a global staple. We've forgotten the cost in sailors' bodies, in indigenous lands, in enslaved labor, and in the quiet work of farmers and traders who moved this plant across the map. So the next time you slice ginger on a cutting board, you are not just cooking. You are touching a piece of the machinery that built parts of the global economy, a fragment of trade routes that once decided who lived, who profited, and who was allowed to taste what the world could grow. That is the real story of the root that was once worth a sheep and how it rode the deadliest spice routes in history.